we should adapt to the world. In fact, our brains are there in order so that we adapt to the environment around us, right? So that's what makes us human and so powerful.
Split Decision, the Decision Science podcast. How much control do we really have over our decisions? Have you ever wanted to go exercise, but you just couldn't get yourself off the couch? Have you ever questioned your social media behavior and asked, why can it be so hard to choose to put down your phone? What do the terms motivation and attention actually mean? And how does research on dopamine help us improve our decision making? These questions and more are discussed in this episode today. I'm Alan Sanfey, your host for this episode of Split Decision, where we discuss the latest findings in the world of decision science and also talk about how this research can help us make better choices in our everyday lives. In this episode, we sit down with Professor Roshan Cools, neuroscientist and expert in the study of cognitive control, to help us better understand what science can tell us about how much control we really have over our own decisions. She'll also share her expert advice and tips on staying motivated in our increasingly complex world. Roshan Cools is Professor of Cognitive Neuropsychiatry at the Department of Psychiatry at Radboud University Nijmegen Medical Centre. She's also Principal Investigator at the Donders Centre for Cognitive Neuroimaging. Her research examines the chemistry of the adaptive mind, that is, the motivational and cognitive control of human decision-making. And this research combines cognitive science, psychopharmacology, brain imaging, and patient data. Welcome, Roshan, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. Very pleased to be here.
And so maybe a first question. So your work looks at things like cognitive control, motivation, and often we use these words in everyday language in conjunction with terms like willpower and mental discipline. Can you maybe tease out how these concepts are different, or if they're even different? And then we can talk about how they might impact choices.
Right. So well, let's start with cognitive control. So that's clearly a rather ill-defined phenomenon, but I think people agree in general that it refers to a set of mental processes that allow us to obtain our goals by resisting distractions, impulses, temptations. But in order to get those goals, we need to be motivated, right? We need to assign value to those goals and energize ourselves to get to it. Willpower is really a more general folk term, I would say, that's used across different disciplines, from philosophy and to neuroscience. And I would say willpower is really a rather non-specific term that we generally break down into cognitive control processes and motivational processes in cognitive neuroscience.
Okay, so motivation is the means by which we can engage these control processes in order to further our goals, whatever they may be.
Exactly.
And to what degree are these control mechanisms under our conscious control? Do you always think of these as things we can kind of deliberately work on, or do they also operate in the background sometimes?
That's a good question. And as I said, it's somewhat ill-defined, but in general, it is not necessarily under cognitive control. So there is some research showing that people can, for example, exert inhibition of prepotent responses, of salient responses, even in the absence of consciousness. So this term, or this phenomenon of consciousness, I would say, is a somewhat separate construct.
Okay, so these can operate across both kind of deliberative action as well as under the hood, so to speak.
Yes.
And you speak a lot, or your research focuses a lot on the pharmacological mechanisms of these processes of control and motivation. Excuse me. So you talk about dopamine and serotonin, and so I guess the common folk idea of dopamine is that the reward chemical, right? You get this little hit of dopamine every time your Instagram beeps. Is that still a valid way of thinking about dopamine, or More complicated?
Yeah, so of course, the story is much more complex. I think it is valid to say that that dopamine, the release of dopamine, helps us get things done. But it does so in a variety of different ways. And it does so by helping us select the goals that are good for us and to maintain those goals, to focus our attention on those goals, not get distracted. It does so by acting on the front part of the brain, but dopamine acts also in other parts of the brain. And there it can help us anticipate those good stuff. So I would say it is generally true that it helps us get to the good things in life, but it does so in many different ways.
Okay.
And by acting on different brain regions, sorry.
Okay. And does serotonin have a similar function, or does that have a different role?
Yeah, so we know, I must say that we know a lot less precisely about what serotonin does exactly. So there have been a number of studies that suggest that serotonin actually acts as a motivational opponent to dopamine. So whereas dopamine is really important to boost effort, mental effort, physical effort, to motivate us, to energize us, to get things done, serotonin has also been implicated instead in suppressing effort in anticipation of bad stuff. So instead of activating behavior, it's much more readily implicated in suppressing behavior.
Is this, broadly speaking, a kind of a fight-flight distinction between these two?
I would say not quite, because fight is also requiring a form of behavioral activation. But for some of these specific questions, I would say the jury is still out.
More research is needed.
Yeah.
So I'm particularly interested in the role of motivation and control in decision making. And what often strikes me when I think about the decision theories is that often they presuppose all of the work is in generating your decision options and thinking through the consequences. So as an example, let's imagine I'm trying to decide whether to go for a run this evening, and I come up with all the reasons why I should. It's good for me. It's nice to be outside. I'll feel healthier. And then I come up with all the reasons against. I'm tired. I don't feel like going outside. It's too hot. I do some kind of pro-con amalgamation, and then I make my decision. And kind of that's where decision theory stops. But what strikes me is that kind of that's almost where motivation begins. And there's quite a big gulf then, I think, in theory between the decision generation and the decision enactment. And I think often that's a really interesting aspect of decision making. We kind of know what we should do, but how do we get ourselves to do it? And so I wonder, could you talk a little bit about that? Is that your view of that motivation is in engaging in the decisions we have already made, or is it kind of already involved in the whole decision process, do you think?
No, I think that's a really good observation. So I do think one form of cognitive control is persisting with the choice that you have, or the option that you have identified to be valuable. So once you have sort of retrieved the fact that going for a run is the best thing for you, cognitive control is needed in order to execute that, to persist with that, and not to kind of revert halfway towards the tempting alternative of sticking to the television. However, I do also think a form of cognitive control is required for making the decision and for weighing the costs and benefits in the first place.
So you mean to actually generate all of the relevant information, you need to be in a certain type of mindset? Is that what you mean by control in that sense? I mean, I guess you could say, yeah, I'm not even motivated to consider that option, right? So maybe you likely need a certain amount of motivation to even think about doing what's best. And, maybe in other timeframes, I don't even generate that set of motivational
That's right.
drives.
Yeah, you can say cognitive control is required for making the right choice, or persisting with the right choice, maybe. But it is also true that decision making is required for exerting control. That's kind of reversing the problem.
Yeah.
Where before engaging in a mentally effortful task that requires control, we need to make a decision about whether it's worth to go there in the first place.
Yeah, because
based on the costs and benefits of that cognitive control activity.
It does strike me that these are studied rather separately, right? There's fields of study looking at motivation, like you, and there's fields of study looking at decision making, like my work does. But I think a more tighter integration might be useful because I think there is this back and forth between these processes, and I'm even presupposing here they're different processes, and I suspect they're much more similar and interrelated under the hood.
Yeah.
But so what then distinguishes a time for when I go for a run, I have the same decision dilemma. Yeah, and one time I do it and I go out and I usually get positively reinforced from doing that. So why doesn't that persist over time? Why the next time I have to make that decision, am I just as likely to sit on the couch as opposed to go for the run? There seems to be not as much kind of positive reinforcement of these kind of motivational choices as maybe I would have thought. So I feel I'm always having to make the same effortful decision to go for a run every time, even though I always enjoy it when it happens.
It's an interesting question. And one is that the cost that accompanies the effortful activity actually discounts the value of that option. So that's a bit of a jargonish word, I suppose, but reduces the value of that particular choice. So that in fact the reinforcement is actually less effective. It's a pretty technical issue.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's interesting that the system would develop like that you would think these positive reinforcers would maybe enhance over time. But is there a pharmacological reason why that's the case?
One way to answer that question is why is effortful activity costly at all? Is that your question? Or yeah, I don't think.
I guess my question is more that I think we often encounter situations where we need to exert control in order to do the right thing, right? The thing we know is best for us in the long term. And that takes this kind of effortful engagement of control and a selection of a certain set of motivations, whether it's kind of good health in the future, or I'm going to go out of my way to recycle because it's ultimately going to be better for me. And yet, no matter how many times we make that decision, every time it still feels effortful. And so I wonder then why we haven't learned where our motivational system hasn't kind of generated some shortcuts, right? That this is, you keep doing this, it keeps being good for you. So why do we kind of constantly need to engage that effort again?
But is it true that this is the case? You say this as if it's
just my running
if it's a truth.
Well, that's how it feels, certainly.
I see.
Feel that it doesn't feel like it gets easier. I feel like kind of consistently have to engage this. Okay, I should do this because it's good for me, and I need to, get off the couch, as opposed to over time it just gets easier and easier. But this is it's an assumption.
I would want to see some evidence for that, because actually my assumption would be by experiencing the reward. Of course, I mean, the reward that you experience after a run is relative, right? Yes, it's associated with this endorphin release and so on. The real goal of running might be a distant reward that you don't experience at that very moment, and in that sense, that reward cannot reinforce.
Because it's not delivered. It's just the prospect of it is delivered.
Yeah, some form of reward that you might be after is not delivered, and so it won't reinforce that effortful action. But I do think having gone for a run and the satisfaction that you do experience does reinforce that behavior. Okay. My personal experience is once I force myself to go even on a weekly basis, it's easier. and we get into a habit, which is exactly the result of this reinforcement. Having said that, of course, a cognitively effortful task is effortful for a reason that is not removed by reinforcement. So,
so the cost
we
is
stick
constant,
to
basically.
Or
the cost doesn't reduce over time. The cost stays the same, and it's this.
Yeah, well, so it depends. So there's different origins of costs, right? Of cost of cognitive effort. So, for one, it's the fact that it takes time means that that we're dealing with an opportunity cost. You can do many other things while you're running for an hour in the woods that you might miss by running in the woods. But also, well, for running, there's also a physical cost. That's pretty obvious, a metabolic cost. For cognitive effort, it's more of a challenge, right? What is the origin of that cognitive cost? Apart from an opportunity cost, which is also interesting, like the value of rest.
And so with that latter one, that's kind of deciding to engage in something that's cognitively hard, right?
Yeah.
So I decide to engage either with a problem I have to solve for work, or maybe it's a Sudoku or a crossword. It's that's the kind of cognitive effort you mean in
exactly
those kind of decisions.
But also let's see, you're dealing with a decision dilemma, and ideally, you know that you need to sit down and think hard about the pros and cons, and you might avoid that activity simply because it's accompanied by a cognitive effort cost. It takes time.
Why is that so aversive, you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the jury is out, but there's various theories. And one of them is indeed that it is associated with a time cost. So deliberation is costly in terms of time. You can't also do anything else. Huh?
But do you believe that? To me, that seems... I mean, people will happily sit and stare at a wall for 10 minutes and or flick through their phone. It feels like people's time isn't that precious, that the reason I don't want to engage in this hard thinking about this hard choice is because, well, I could be, doing something productive. So
let's say it's true that people also stare at the wall for 10 minutes, but when they don't in those 10 minutes engage in difficult calculations, they will allow alternative processes to take place. The kind of process that also take place during rest and during sleep. In fact, there's this recent work that just came out about how one origin of mental effort costs might relate to a missed opportunity for replay, for consolidation of memories, which is exactly what happens when the brain is at rest. So missing the opportunity of rest during which memories are consolidated might be one factor that contributes. What's certainly the case is that the type of mental processes that are experienced as costly, those are the ones associated with the prefrontal cortex, are not necessarily accompanied by a greater metabolic cost than, let's say, visual processes that also activate the brain to the same degree, but in a different part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I find this interesting because it also strikes me that often people don't want to think hard about a tough decision, right? And it's easier to avoid it. Hence, procrastination of decisions. There's decision deferral is well known, where if people are given the choice to put the decision off to tomorrow, they often do it. And then I wonder, and certainly there could be some role of that, my brain could be doing something more useful with this 20 minutes than thinking about this. I mean, I think there's also an acknowledgement, though, that, it's not pleasant to have to adjudicate between two difficult options, right? It feels hard work. Now, of course, as you suggest, it's probably not metabolically hard work, but it feels motivationally hard work, or it feels like I need to engage a lot of control to think about that.
Exactly.
And so given that it seems unlikely that it's, costing me physical effort, what other possibilities could there be for why is it aversive to engage this kind of level of control?
This control, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly the kind of question we ask, right? And what's really striking is that the type of a task that requires inhibition of novel input, inhibition of behaviors, resisting of distraction. That's exactly the kind of process that is aversive. So people avoid the type of tasks that require suppression of other input and other tasks and other activities and other opportunities.
Because it feels aversive, or at least people anticipate that it will feel aversive.
Yeah, it does feel aversive. So it is accompanied almost by a sense of pain.
Yeah.
And we experience that, right? So when we have to focus on one thing and make sure that this is partly, I think, what underlies the Zoom fatigue is because, you know, when I am in a room with you, if we would have done this interview in a room, it would have been really just you, this interview that I could concentrate on. Now I'm staring at you, but actually my email is right there. Also, there's all this alternative stuff I could do that I have to suppress the whole time. And now, of course, while I'm engaging with this conversation, it doesn't feel so effortful. But if I'm listening to some project proposal meeting, it's much harder. And the fatigue that you feel, the effort cost of that is really significantly higher. I am convinced that is to do with an opportunity cost
of these, and I mean, does that suggest that's worse these days because we have these smartphones there's a million different things that could pop up?
Exactly. And I think it's also adaptive that it works this way because it's not only true that we have more distractions in our lives, it's also true that there is that the world has become more volatile. And that in other words, the information that we are given is not always irrelevant. A lot of the messages that are sent to us are actually really relevant, and they require a form of flexibility. So the idea that a mental effort cost, serves as a motivational signal to do something else, to stop doing what you're doing and to shift attention and to flexibly adapt. That's actually quite adaptive if the frequency of distractions is an index of the changeability of the world.
That you should be open to these distractions because it's in your ultimate best interest.
Yeah. The question is, how adaptive is it to focus on the same thing for a very long time if that is accompanied by missing a whole load of messages that are quite salient and important for you?
Does that suggest we're going to lose the deep thinkers, or we're going to lose the ability to kind of think hard and focus on a problem? I'm sure you've had the experience, right, where you need to figure something out and you just need to put effort into thinking about it.
Yeah.
Is that become harder for you? Have you noticed, or do you think
I'm like right now I'm in this sort of week of trying to think of what's the kind of main message of my next grant application. And really all I'm doing for this whole week, apart from this interview, is staring at 3 slides. And I'm trying to sort of foreground this one message. And that involves mostly thinking. I'm not going to read articles now. I've read a lot of articles in the past, so I'm just going to try and think. And in the meantime, of course, all this other stuff is piling up. And despite me having just done one thing the whole week and sat there staring at my screen, I'm totally wiped out. And it's much more tiring to do that than to, switch flexibly between emailing and then, writing this paper and then talking to my students. So very motivating. And then, I'm going with the flow. I'm flexibly adapting and going with all those new messages. That's maybe it's just me, but I don't think so. I think we've got better at that, right? We've got better at this ability to do these micro tasks and that's adaptive in a world that changes rapidly.
But of course, it comes often at a cost to when it's better for you to actually put your focus somewhere it may be, correspondingly more difficult. Yeah. And are we kind of doomed slaves of our external environment? I mean, is it just we're in this world and this is the way it's structured, and hence our motivational systems just adapt? Or is any of this under our own control?
Well, so I think we should adapt to the world. In fact, our brains are there in order so that we adapt to the environment around us, right? So that's what makes us human and so powerful.
Even if it's an unhealthy environment?
Well, the question, if it is unhealthy. So if the world, I mean, what you're asking is there a way for us to influence the environment? Is that right?
No, I'm asking, is it not necessarily influence the environment? Is there a way to maintain our own set of kind of motivational principles despite the environment? Or are we, just kind of...
Well, we might, so I would say we might detect this fact, or we might make this observation that the world is changing so rapidly, and so that is necessarily accompanied by reduced ability to focus for a longer period of time on something. If we decide that's suboptimal, then we might, intervene with our world and make some form of pre-commitment. On the small scale, put yourself in a room that's deprived of, deprive yourselves of...
Lock yourself in an empty room.
Yeah, but obviously that's very relative. Yeah. You know what's happening outside of your little dark room. This is not going to work, but that is possible. But of course, yeah.
So, and I'm also interested in the individual differences here, because obviously you study clinical populations as well as kind of non-clinical folk. And so again, to what degree do you think these motivational skills and control skills are trainable? Because I think you do see quite big differences across people. And you've tied it to, fundamental dopamine function, right? So you had I think a really interesting recent paper on smartphone usage and dopamine synthesis. Was it? So maybe you could just say a quick word about that, and then as a way of talking about kind of how individual differences might be trainable or not.
Yeah, I can talk a bit about that study, but first, yes, I think in principle, we should be able to train this type of meta control. I think that's what we're talking about, of detecting. So well, there's so much in your question, right? So mental disorders. The way I conceptualize of many mental health disorders like depression or ADHD is in terms of a bias in the way we perceive the world, given genetic background, given early life experiences, given more recent experiences. So, for example, a particular individual might perceive the world as super changeable. In the context of that observation, their distractible behavior is really quite adaptive. It's quite normative. Given the perception that the world is changing the whole time, it's quite unreliable also that you go with the flow. It's quite adaptive. What the implication of that is that we can help, if that's interfering with their life, that fact, then we can help them by, I don't think necessarily by helping them to focus exclusively, because focus is appropriate in some environments but not in other, but to help them detect when the environment in fact is not changing. And yeah, so it's about training meta control, but that is
right. So behavior is in a sense always adaptive given one's expectations about the world. And just sometimes those expectations are not in line with reality, and hence you get behavior that causes problems. Is that the...
Yeah, I don't know if all disorders can be accounted for by a bias in the perception of the world.
Attentional
but
disorders,
some of these, but depression also. I think some forms of depression can be conceptualized as a bias in thinking that the world is rather uncontrollable, for example. even when it is controllable. But and so what people exhibit is a rather a lack of action, inaction, or anhedonia, or apathy, and that might also be appropriate in a world that's not controllable.
Right.
But maybe this is getting really complex.
No, I think it's people can understand these concepts.
But in any case, yeah, I do believe, but it has not yet been shown. So I must say that there's a lot of work needed to study the potential for meta-control training, and there are labs doing that sort of thing. Now, what we showed in that particular paper was a correlation between the degree to which dopamine, to which individual brains make a dopamine, so this capacity to synthesize dopamine, and the degree to which they use social apps on their mobile phone. So what we did is we leveraged a study that we did in which we gave in healthy people a PET scan with which we measure dopamine synthesis capacity. And then later on, we measured their smartphone use for a period of a few weeks. And so first we saw the expected pattern that more dopamine is associated with more button presses in general. That's this thing that I described earlier, that dopamine is there to activate behavior and motivate behavior. But on top of that, there was this negative correlation between dopamine and social app use. So the more dopamine you made, the less you were maybe a victim of your social app. That's one way to interpret it. We have to be careful to not overinterpret it, but one way is to think of this is to think that higher levels of dopamine enabled a form of self-control.
But specifically in the social apps.
Yes. So
that's an interesting, because I haven't seen that before, where say dopamine might be tied not just to reward in general, but maybe a specific type of reward. So do you draw any conclusions there about the kind of social nature of social media rewards versus, playing a game on my phone or getting an email, or can you make any claims about that?
I am careful about assigning the effect to specifically the social nature of these apps, because what I suspect is that social apps are more salient, and because of their kind of immediately rewarding nature. And we know that dopamine is released when we're confronted with salient reward-related events and actions.
Was there any relationship between dopamine and people's feeling of whether they were, too engaged in their social app usage?
I would have loved to have that data, but we didn't have it.
Okay.
But that would indeed have been the kind of evidence we would need to interpret that in terms of a control effect.
Sure. Yeah. But I think it's a really nice example of where you can really tie this very basic fundamental from psychopharmacology to the most real world behavior we see in front of us these days. So maybe I can just conclude then with just kind of broadening that last question out by asking about your kind of views as to how this kind of work, and your last study being a good example. I mean, could you see ways that could kind of usefully inform society and social policy? In this case, maybe, app usage. Do you see linkages there, or do you think that's important for you to do, or do you think that's important for other people to do, or kind of what's your view on societal findings more generally? Scientific findings more generally, and their role in societal policy.
Yeah, very important. Actually, I think the immediate impact of behavioral brain science or cognitive brain science, the kind of stuff we do, is that it illustrates the power of our minds and our beliefs. And I think, in terms of what we see, what we hear, in terms of what makes us happy, in terms of what we choose to do, what we believe, what we expect to happen as a function of dopamine is influencing what we perceive, what we feel, and what we do. And I think that observation can be leveraged in many ways. Addressing policy for...
So this is the idea of kind of putting behavior into the context of the processes that underlie the behavior. Is it that by better understanding them? So take the dopamine smartphone example, that, you know, we shouldn't just say, you know, person one is on social media all the time and person two isn't. The behavior itself may not be indicative of any issue, right? If it's kind of correlated with the underlying. I guess what I'm trying to say is, does that give us a way of understanding the behavior in a slightly more sophisticated way, rather than just focusing on the behavior itself as maybe an indicator of kind of good or bad practices? Is that what you mean by
the power of mind? So it may be best to illustrate it. I don't know how much time we have, but if we stick with the dopamine, we know that dopamine boosts motivation, effort, increase the value of an option. Now, we also know that the mere act of choosing increases dopamine, regardless of the value of that option. And so this is just to illustrate to give an example of how knowledge about dopamine kind of provides a biological explanation for subjective experiences and behaviors. So in some cases, it's better to make a random choice than no choice at all, right? And that can clearly be leveraged to, mitigate depression, burnout. But similar kind of observations can be leveraged probably for counteracting polarization or climate change behavior.
Yeah, one good example of that's in use already is this idea of defaults, where a decision is kind of pre-made for me. And I can change it if I want, but I don't have to. And in a way, then I get all the benefits of having a decision made without the costs of having to make the decision. And of course, defaults can be abused, but if the default is kind of carefully thought through in advance, that might be a way by which we get to have the best of both worlds a little bit along the lines.
That's right. And so I think the value of providing a biological explanation is also illustrated, for example, by the placebo effect, which is known to increase dopamine to almost the same degree as administration of a dopamine drug. So as soon as we realize that just expecting that a treatment will work or that a intervention will work will actually do something to your brain that is also done with drugs, then that'll influence how we treat interventions. Or think about obesity releasing hormones in the gut. They're influenced by what we believe a particular food does to us. So the leptin, for example, this obesity-related hormone, is quite different after intake of a milkshake that's described as really healthy, a diet thing, compared with when it is unhealthy, fattening. It's affecting stuff in our gut, Now that's huge, and by providing a biological explanation of some of these things we know, we can really, I think, boost the power of our mind, and that should be used to the good rather than the bad, clearly. But I think that's the immediate impact of the kind of stuff we do. And clearly there's other impacts like neurotechnology, brain-computer interfaces, precision medicine, precision education, policy, indeed nudging and so on. But
but driving these type of interventions via the better understanding of the mechanism seems a very positive way forward. Well, we'll wrap up there. So I want to thank you, Roshan. That was very illuminating, and I think I've learned enough that I will go on my run, because I feel I should after all that talk about it.
Maybe it'll get easier. Yeah.
Maybe it'll get easier. I'll try and monitor it over the course of the next weeks. So thanks very much, and we much appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Split Decision. We look forward to joining you again soon. To learn more about Roshan's work on cognitive control, you can follow her on Twitter at @CoolsControl. That's at COOLSCONTROL, as well as her website www.roshancools.com. To hear more episodes like this and to stay up to date on the latest in decision science from the Radboud Centre for Decision Science, subscribe to our podcast, follow us at Decision Centre, visit us at www.centerefordecisionscience.nl. Thanks for listening.